Good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Kim Casey. I'm an associate professor of political science here at Northwest. I also have 2 degrees in history, so you're going to find this is a little bit of a combination of a talk that you might hear in political science, but also one that you might have some kind of background with history. This is part of the Occupy Valk series, and the Valk series was created by the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences to allow professors to talk about issues pertaining to diversity and inclusion. So hence the reason why University Seminar is able to come to these sessions and get a little bit of our additional knowledge about these topics. So thank you for coming, and I'm going to get started. This topic, why slavery, was something that evolved for me during the summer of 2020, like most of all of us, watching the events that were occurring in society. But this actually coincided with me writing a master's thesis in history. Now, political science students, don't worry, I got my degrees in political science as well. But I was working on a master's thesis in history, and I was looking particularly at Thomas Jefferson, and so that was taking me kind of deep into the colony of Virginia. And so with that, you cannot help but come across slavery, because Virginia was the first state to have slaves. It was the largest of, or first colony, excuse me, to have slaves. It was the largest of the colonies, and it had the largest slave population. So this got me to thinking about this issue of why did the colonists go down the road of slavery in the first place? And then what differences does this make? So why did the English colonists begin enslaving peoples? And then why did the British government allow for this practice? Because it is important to note that the English, and then when they merged with Scotland, they became the British, did not have slavery as a part of their recent culture. You have to go back hundreds of years to find when there was some slavery in the British Isles. In fact, you have to go back to before 1200 to find that. And then the other question that I was pondering was, why was American slavery unique? There is a uniqueness to this that hadn't evolved before in world history. And so we're going to talk about that. And then I was going to try and stuff in the third question, realized I had too much information. So I'm actually going to continue this talk next semester to address question 3. All right, the institution of slavery, as you may realize if you take your World Civ course or from some other course that deals with the past, is something that wasn't new in terms of world culture. And if you go back into the ancient world, if you go back certainly before American colonization, there were 2 dominant types of slavery. One was known as chattel slavery. And this was when a person has total ownership of another. Typically, this was associated with conquest or dominance. I am enslaving you because I can, and I need your labor, was basically the thrust of that. Then there was a second type of slavery that existed in the ancient world that is known by a variety of different names. So sometimes it's called peonage. That's really more of a modern connotation here. In the ancient world, if you've had any of Dr. Gillis' classes, you might have learned a little bit about debt slavery. That was popular in the ancient Greek civilization, or it's a type of bonded labor. So this has more characteristics to it. Typically, it involves the pledge of a person's services as security for repayment for a debt or any kind of other obligation. The terms of the repayment are typically not clearly or reasonably stated, and the person who is holding the debt thus has some control over the laborer. In terms of American colonization, this gets in, or this is pushed into a system that we know as indentured servitude. And they would keep the terms relatively liquid with this idea of, if you complete your service, maybe we'll give you some land, maybe. And they kept people on the hook with that unsuredness of the terms. Freedom is typically in this arrangement assumed upon the repayment of the debt, however that is decided. And the English at the beginning of colonization look at this and they try and use this system. Again, they call it indentured servitude. And they were attached to the use of contracts to legitimize peonage of English subjects. So this appeared for most Englishmen as either something that's voluntary or they attached it to a criminal sentence. So you're going to serve a term, and instead of us putting you in a nice, lovely English prison, we're going to put you on a ship and we're going to ship you somewhere, and we're going to force you to labor to pay off your sentence. So that is where the debt was involved. And the debt may have in fact been because you were in debt to somebody. All right, time goes on, 476 CE, the Roman Empire falls, and you continue to see slavery as an institution both in the areas where Rome had predominated, but also you see it amongst the German tribal groups that lived to the north. And they're typically enslaving other tribes that they don't like. So it's much more of this concept of chattel slavery. There was a part of the world, however, that didn't collapse as a result of the fall of Rome. And so we're talking more about the eastern part of what had been the Roman Empire. And with that, we're trying to sort of see two traditions intersect. So slavery was treated differently amongst peoples as we enter the Middle Ages. And then we get these two intersecting traditions. One will be what happens in those areas that are conquered by Islamic followers. The other will be what happens in an area known as the Iberian Peninsula. And if you don't know it by that name, you probably know Spain and Portugal. So that's the region that we're talking about. Okay, so this map shows the spread of Islam. Islam begins in the Arabian Peninsula, and then they have a mission to spread Islam. As they head west, they just go over the northern sector of Africa. They cross the Strait of Gibraltar, and they go into this region, which was known as the Iberian Peninsula. It takes about 100 years for that to happen. Now, in Islam, slavery was allowed, but you weren't supposed to enslave people of the Islamic faith. It had to be somebody else. So even here, they have already made contacts with people in Africa, and they begin enslaving people of African descent because they haven't been converted. As they sweep across here, yes, they're enslaving as they go as part of this, but then, whoops, these people have converted to Islam. They really shouldn't be enslaved. So they begin looking further south. That takes us to the second map here. This is a map of Africa showing where the centers of African slave trade were. So typically, as Islam spreads across this northern part, you see these two centers, one in pink and the one in purple, becoming really important sources for slaves. And then as they cross the Strait of Gibraltar and they enter into the Iberian Peninsula, slavery had never gone out of practice, even after the Roman Empire fell. So the Islamic invaders, as they come in, they're finding people that already live there. They're used to slavery. They've got slaves. It is something that is culturally acceptable in this region. And so this is something that never actually goes out of practice. And we'll talk more about that here in a moment because it's going to affect the larger world picture. Okay, so if you go further north in Europe, you reach people who are more of Germanic descent. So they're from Northern Europe. And or actually two of those groups that settle in England, they're the Angles and the Saxons. They become the arbiters of Anglo-Saxon culture, which dominates in England from roughly about 500 to roughly about 1200 CE. And in Anglo-Saxon culture, it was acceptable for people to enslave their fellow Anglo-Saxons. So it's estimated in the critical year 1066, about 10% of Anglo-Saxon society was enslaved to other Anglo-Saxons. They also tended to sell each other to other peoples. So yeah, this is something that is part of their culture. But things are going to dramatically shift beginning in 1066. 1066, Anglo-Saxon England is conquered by a group of people known as the Normans. And the Normans come from that area of northern France known as Normandy, but they were Viking, they were Northern Germanic in their orientation, and these group of big bad Vikings had come down. They had taken this territory in France, and they'd set up shop there for about 200 years and developed a culture. About 50 years before the Norman conquest of England, they have decided that slavery is morally wrong, and they begin to reject slavery within their own culture. So as they come into England, they're coming with that mindset of, we don't like slavery. And they also see Anglo-Saxon culture as being a little bit less sophisticated than their own culture. And so this is one of the things that they try and get rid of. They try and get rid of virtually everything. The thing that really sticks is the language. The Anglo-Saxons don't want to give up their base language. But slavery, it goes away. So by 1200, there is no slavery in that country that now we can properly call England, or the land of the Angles. At the same time that the Normans are establishing their culture, their monarchy is also establishing the tenets for what we call common law. So it's law that's based upon precedent. So somebody makes a decision about a certain area, and that becomes, okay, that's what we do. That becomes acceptable. It's not quite law in the same sense that we have it made by Congress today, but it is a type of law. So because there is no slavery, they're not making adjudications on the issue of slavery. Slavery does not exist for the English people. And it's not part of their tradition, it's not part of their culture, it's not part of their law. So time marches on, and the English become exposed to people from other parts of Europe through trade, through monarchy, and princesses marrying different people and coming into the country. And what we notice is that the English didn't have a very good reaction to peoples that they considered to be too different from them. And they tended to mark differences that were physical. And so beginning, and Dr. Gilly will contest this, but yes, there were people of color, people from different areas that came into England, but they were relatively rare. You see a real influx of people, however, in the early 1500s, because a Spanish princess, where there is slavery, marries an English prince, and she starts bringing people over that are descended from Africans. And so this doesn't go very well. And one of the things that I thought was interesting in researching this was the problem that the English had with the concept of black. Initially, before they begin to meet people who they designate as having black skin, they see blackness as an internal quality, that it's associated with something negative, or, I mean, you could take it to the extent of even evil, okay? It's a darkness within. And they start becoming acquainted with people who are darker skin, and they label them as black. And that has a specific connotation for the English that they don't quite like this idea of, is this an externalization of this internal issue, or is there blackness on the inside that's leading to blackness on the outside? And that sounds kind of remedial maybe to us, but that's kind of how they took it. It's just not a very good cultural mixing. It doesn't go very well. Well, in that same century, you begin to have the English trying to colonize. They start the process in the 1570s. They continue to try through the 1580s. They're colonizing they're trying to colonize not just in the American territory, but also in the Caribbean region. You don't get a permanent settlement until Jamestown is established in 1607. And this picture doesn't show very well in this light, but this is an actual depiction of what they think Jamestown looked like. And the fort was triangular shaped. And so I don't forget to say this. This is the only surviving building of colonial Jamestown. It's of much later duration. They built the brick much later, but it's our piece of their history, and it was actually built on site of one of the earliest churches. All right, so Jamestown is established, and there's multiple things going on in the world. One of the reasons why the English settled at Jamestown was to get away from threats. They were particularly concerned about the Spanish coming to raid their colony. And the Spanish have been colonizing for over 100 years by this time. So have the Portuguese. And with their colonization, they have also spread, and they have continued the use of slaves, because that is a cultural norm for them. It is probably important to note, so I don't forget to say this, that the Portuguese would enslave anybody. If they could dominate you, they'd enslave you. There's stories of they were actually also going like into India, they were going to China, they were even got to Japan. And so they're actually enslaving anybody that they can. So their enslavement of Africans was not just because they were African, it's because they had an opportunity to enslave Africans. And the Spanish followed along with that because the two peoples were very competitive with one another. All right, so how does this affect the English? Well, I put here it's incidental but inevitable. And I think that's a good way to state that, because slavery comes to Jamestown by accident, but yet I think it was always going to come to the American colonies. Because in 1616, the English began using Africans as labor for tobacco plantations on the island of Bermuda, which is basically far off the coast of North Carolina today. So they've already looked at what the Spanish are doing, what the Portuguese are doing. They're using labor that they're buying to try and fuel whatever labor needs they need. So the British pick up on this with their tobacco plantations. And of course, in 1612, tobacco had been introduced into Virginia. So there's a common thread there. But slaves haven't arrived just yet. July 30th, 1619, we kind of celebrate as an important day in government. That's the meeting of the first House of Burgesses, which begins the process of colonial self-representation. 3 weeks to the day later, on August 20th, 1619, we know what happened. There was a ship of Africans that they were actually being carried on probably a Dutch ship. And it's quite a story, but basically they were on initially a Spanish ship. They were bound for New Spain, which today we'd call Mexico. And the ship was captured by this Dutch ship. And the slaves were taken off the Dutch ship and they were put on, or they were taken off the Spanish ship and they were put on 2 Dutch ships. So this is the first one arriving in Jamestown in 1619. On August 27th, the second ship arrives. And so we can begin to kind of then see how slavery begins to evolve in Virginia. So they take a census. We're not the first people to create a census, by the way, in March of 1620, and we know exactly how many slaves were alive at this time. There were 17 female and 15 male Africans that were in Jamestown colony. They belonged essentially to 3 different men. And there's lots of historical debate on how they were treated. Were they treated actually as slaves? Were they treated as indentured servants? Were they something else? And as much as I could read about it, indicates, I think, that they were properly being treated as slave laborers. But that also the colonists weren't really sure of exactly how this fit in with their government and their legal processes. But the governor was the primary holder of some of these Africans. And so if the governor's doing it, well, must be okay. So that becomes the status quo. And we know that no more Africans arrived in Jamestown until 1628. So you've got this very small group of slave laborers, but you haven't initiated a slave trade yet. Now, to show you how early this is, the next year, 1620, that's when the Mayflower gets to the New World. So this is happening before even the Pilgrims get to the Western Hemisphere. All right, March 22nd, 1622, something happens in the history of Jamestown that is going to shift attitudes. There was a massacre by the Powhatan people. So Pocahontas, this was her uncle and that group of natives. And they massacre, and Pocahontas is dead, by the way, and that's part of the reason why they did this. But the Jamestown massacre occurs outside of Jamestown, so they're going after the settlements that are outside of the fort, basically. And it results somewhere in the loss of 1/4 to 1/3 of the colonists in Jamestown. And this changes the colonists' view of the Powhatan people, of the natives that they have been trying to somehow interact with. And they begin to try and enslave the natives. And they have the same result that most Western peoples had when they tried to enslave Native American peoples. They died, they ran away, it didn't work very well. So elimination through diaspora and dwindling numbers. So they're either leaving or they're dying. Well, by them leaving, by there being less Indians, that means there's more land that isn't threatened. Oh, what can we do with all that land? Tobacco, super cool. We can make lots of money if we can grow more tobacco. So that becomes an issue. How do we get enough labor? Well, we're going to try and increase the number of indentured servants who are coming over. Except they find that the English don't do very well in the climate and with the mosquitoes. And so they continue to struggle with labor. All right, a big development happens in 1637 when the English island of Barbados is subject to the introduction of sugarcane. And I don't know about you, I like sugar. Sugar's yummy. And the Europeans, this is something new to them. They get very excited about this new and addictive product. And so the demand leaps exponentially. And so as a result of this introduction of sugarcane, there is intensive labor involved. It was horrific, the practices involved with the harvesting and the creation of sugar. And they've decided, because they're getting the cues from the Portuguese and the Spanish who are already growing sugarcane, that Africans do really well with the sugarcane labor. Now, were they any better than anybody else who could have been trained to do it? No, probably not. They were just a little bit better suited to the climate, and they could be forced. And so that's where the real issues come in. So by the 1640s, I mean, this just grows by leaps and bounds. Slaves with African heritage begin to be sold in Virginia because the Virginians decide, okay, here's an easy answer to our labor issues in Virginia. We're going to get slaves too. And so they begin to import slaves, and they are helped by the British basically taking over certain trading spots in Africa. And a lot of that they take from the Portuguese. And by 1650, the British dominate the slave trade from Africa. So this is a map that you might have seen even in elementary school looking at the slave trade. So this triangle represents how the trade of slaves and other products basically occurred during this particular period of time. And let's see, Africans were enslaved because they could be. This was something that the English could get to in Africa, and then they had the ability to have the items that were in demand to help facilitate the slave trade. Yes, are Africans helping with this? Yes. Are other European peoples helping with this? Yes. So there's multiple parties involved in the taking of slaves in Africa. They are also seen as inferior, culturally speaking. So this gives the English an excuse to do what they're doing, but they like the fact that they're maybe a little bit more acclimated to warmer climates. So they see this as another excuse to use their labor. It took about 40 years to shift from Africans, though, with that concept of they're here for labor and they are laborers, to the practice of what we call race-based slavery. So if we are asking the question, how is this different? This is how American slavery becomes different. And I don't just mean slavery in the United States or in the American colonies. This was a British venture. And it is slavery based upon the idea that you look different and therefore you must be different because you look different. And with the difference in skin color, then it makes it very easy to know this person is bound for slavery and this person, because they look different, is not. So this is the first time in world history that we can really identify it's because of what you look like, not because you're people that we've conquered, or even because we don't like you. It's simply because you look different. All right. The law then is increasingly used to distinguish people of African descent and their status within Virginia. And so we're going to turn and talk a little bit about Virginia here. Initially, contractual indentures, or the indentured servitude or prison sentences, separated the status of temporary white labor from enslaved peoples. So were you contractually bound? Were you the peonage type of slavery? Or were you something else? Were you moving towards property, where you were chattel slavery? And that becomes a distinguishing factor. And we begin to see this process carried out in the law in Virginia colony. In 1640, a Virginia court sentenced a rebellious servant, okay, who was a slave, John Punch, to a lifetime of slavery. So he was somebody who was of African descent, and they make this a permanent situation. And it's the first time in law that we see this becoming permanent. Then I think this is the big one, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. In 1662, a Virginia court ruled that children born to enslaved mothers were the property of the mother's owner. So now they have a way, other than just importing slaves, to designate that if you are born in Virginia, you're not a colonist. What are you? Well, you have the status of your mother, and if your mother is a slave, you are going to be a slave, and it doesn't matter who your father is. And that becomes more egregious, as we'll see. And then you get a progression of laws that progressively mark slaves as chattel, meaning property, with no rights. And a spate of those laws are passed in 1705. And I've got a link there where there's a long list of the laws that were passed in the colony of Virginia legalizing the institution of slavery. So what differed about Anglo or British slavery? It was based upon your ancestry and your skin color. Slaves were considered different and inferior because of their skin color, their other physical characteristics, as well as their cultural background. You aren't us, you are them. We're going to separate ourselves by this institution. And there's a little bit, although this doesn't really take as much root in Virginia until the United States is formed, but there's also this idea of there's a biblical acceptance of slavery, providing an excuse for their treatment. So there's some things in the Bible where in the New Testament, there's an allowance for slavery. There's things where they talk about how slaves should behave. That was used as an excuse. And even further back in the Old Testament, there was a story that one of Noah's sons was cursed, and that resulted in the enforced slavery of the descendants of that son of Noah. All right, in 1662, this ruling also makes some things clear. Enslavement was an inherited state accruing from an enslaved mother and thus perpetual. As long as you had female slaves and they were having children, you were going to keep the institution of slavery. If a person was enslaved, their ancestors came from Africa and therefore were considered black. And if one was born into the institution, regardless of parentage, you were a slave. So here's where things really get dicey. Owners begin to use their slaves as sex partners, but not just with the purpose of having sex. They use slaves as breeding materials. So they're going to impregnate their slaves with their own children and create more slaves. Now, some of that was incidental, some of it was purposeful, but there was a lot of that going on. And so it behooved the master to make sure that the slaves were in fact impregnated so they could make more slaves. And so this then becomes its own, not just institution, but its own financial reward. So it's not just the labor of slaves that becomes valuable, it's slaves as property. And the more slaves you have, the richer you were seen in society. The use of Africans for labor and sexual gratification became normalized by other peoples in Europe. And so as this happened, what happens to the English culture of not having slavery? Well, our rivals are doing it. Spain and Portugal are doing it, and they become super powerful. In fact, Spain became so powerful in the 1580s, they tried to conquer England. England does not want that. And so they've got to figure out a way to be competitive. So this is what they're doing. This is what we're going to do to help our economic situation. As part of what the English begin to think of as part of their thought process, dehumanizing others did support an English sense of superiority. We're better than them because we can enslave them. They don't know the things we know. We don't even think they can learn the things that we know. So we're going to make sure that they don't become educated because that could create a problem. The English also reacted unusually poorly to the physical differences, as I mentioned, and poor Virginia and Native American relations exacerbated the English dislike of others. The physical characteristics were easy to distinguish and allowed separation. And fear of not adopting slavery would mean weakness in comparison to other countries and result in a lack of competitiveness. If we don't participate in this, we may be seen as being lesser to our European rivals. So we better get on the bandwagon and participate in this venture. And then, we're going to take it over and we're going to dominate it and we're going to make more money because we have the slave trade as well as all the other things that we're trading. All right, other reasons why the English got involved. The demand for labor-intensive products that they could only produce with significant influx of labor. I talked in my intro classes about a lot of the things that the English targeted were things that not only were nice, they were addictive. Tobacco, addictive. Sugar, addictive. Rum, alcohol that was being produced by sugar could be addictive. So they're very careful about what they choose to develop in terms of large-scale agriculture. The benefits for the English economy were more diverse than just the products of labor. Slave trade, like I said, became its own industry, and your wealth was measured in how many slaves you had. There are questions whether the wealthiest person circa about the time he became president in 1789 was not in fact George Washington. Why? Because he was probably the largest slave owner in the United States in terms of the number of slaves he controlled. Now, he technically didn't own all of them. I know that's not helpful, but in terms of what Martha had plus what he had, yes, he's a sizable slave owner. All right, for the English, there were incentives to participate, and there was no disincentive with the exception of morality. So you had those lone voices out there crying about, oh, you really shouldn't be doing that. Aren't those human beings? This isn't a good thing. And the need for wealth, the need for the labor that slaves could provide totally washed. Oops, I hit. As my students know, I hit the thing often. But it totally then makes no reason why they should have to give this up, and every reason why they should keep the practice. So financial considerations bested moral considerations at this particular juncture. All right, continuing. Why did the British government and law allow the practice? The government also profits from the slave trade because it's going to increase shipping. It increases the revenue that comes directly to the nation, because you've got all sorts of things like your tariffs and things of that nature, the carrying of slaves. They're making money off of this, as are certain government actors from the king on down. They're investing in things like slave trade. And slaves are also allowed in Britain. They never reach large proportions because they don't need them for agricultural purposes. So they're mostly house servants or slaves, and they're a sign of wealth and prosperity for the owners. So they become a status symbol, which is really kind of sick and bizarre. Now, through all of this, the colonial law allows for slavery. The law in England or in Great Britain never changes. They never rule on the issue of slavery until 1772. A case comes before the English court that you have a slave, Somerset, suing for his freedom based upon his being taken from the colonies to England. And so in that case, the attorney, or he's basically our equivalent of a chief justice, he rules that there was no inclusion of slavery in common law. He can't make a judgment because there is no precedent on the issue of slavery, and it's not in their legal code anywhere. So the institution is found to be non-existent in Great Britain, and the slave is actually freed. Of course, in the colonies, this news gets back, and they don't like that. Don't underestimate that this isn't part of the reason why they're feeling like they need to separate from Britain. This concerns them greatly. So it didn't outlaw the practice, but the case caused many to think about the repercussions of slavery. And the British are actually going to reject slavery far earlier than certainly the Americans will. But the British colonists back in the New World or Western Hemisphere institutionalized slavery, and the British did not step in to stop what the colonists were doing. All right, some of this is just review. I've already talked about some of these issues, but you've got all of these issues kind of combining here. And over time, you see an intensification of the treatment of people who are of African descent or who are even suspected of being African descent, but they may not be wholly of African descent because you are getting so much of that racial integration because of what owners are doing to their female slaves. So in the 17th and early 18th centuries, Virginia slaves could be freed, they could earn money, and they could buy their freedom. How frequent this was, probably not terribly frequent, but there are people that we can see that did happen. People who were former slaves, freed blacks, could own property, and they were actually expected to participate as citizens. So they could do things like vote if they had enough property ownership. But those laws in the early 18th century, beginning in 1705, increasingly restricted slaves' access to freedom and blacks' ability to vote or hold positions of power. And by the time the United States is an entity and Virginia is a state, a law was passed requiring freed slaves to leave the state within a year or for them to be re-enslaved. Those who remained tended to be poorer and identify more with enslaved blacks than with whites. So their status, if they stay, tends to not be as good, even if they aren't enslaved. There was a slave owner who actually in his will asked for his children born of one of his slaves to be accepted from this rule. And that person's name is Thomas Jefferson, because Jefferson had 4 children with one of his slaves. All right. This treatment confirmed to authorities their status as a suspect class, leading to further restrictions on their freedom. There are my sources, and I made it in time. That was my big fear. Do you all have any questions? I know I went through that rather quickly. But that is basically how the institution of slavery kind of took hold in Virginia. And next semester, I'm going to talk a little bit about its relationship between the founding fathers and the beginning of American government. As I mentioned, Thomas Jefferson did in fact have an affair with his slaves. DNA does not lie. And yes, he had 4 children by one of his slaves who happened to be the half sister of his dead wife. So it is all very torrid. But yes, Jefferson had a grandson who was a member of the Union Army and was terrified that people would find out that he had Black ancestry. He was red-haired like his grandfather, he looked like his grandfather, and yet he had to live in fear of his past. Thank you very much. Have a great night.